about what your rights are if the environmental review isn't completed the way we think it should be done. In other words, if they leave out an alternative, or they, in talking about, let's say, the routes that come through this area, they don't give a good disclosure about the adverse impacts in this area. What are your rights if BPA shortchanges you, if you will, in the environmental analysis? The law is written to allow you to take BPA to court at that time, and we've done a lot of those cases. You're challenging the adequacy of the environmental impact statement, and there are hundreds, probably thousands of these lawsuits in the books over the years. Very common type of environmental lawsuit where you challenge the adequacy of the environmental review. And if you think at the end of the process, so this is after the draft comes out, after the final comes out, and BPA makes a decision, and they say, we're coming this way. At that point, you're allowed to go to court and say, wait a second, judge, they've made a decision based on an environmental review that's not adequate. And the judge goes back and looks at what they've done and decides whether that environmental review was adequate or not. Was it done in good faith? Did it make the disclosures? Did it provide the BPA with the information they need, honestly, to make that decision? And if the judge decides the EIS is not adequate, was not done in good faith, decision gets thrown out, and BPA gets sent back to redo their work. There are other possible legal attacks if they decide to come this way, apart from the environmental review process. Remember at the beginning I said this is primarily a political decision. Primarily, yes, there are some legal obstacles potentially out there for them as well. And this is where you get into issues of endangered species and issues like that. And those laws may provide opportunities to block one route versus another. But I'll tell you at the outset, not very likely. The Endangered Species Act is probably the best hope a group would have for putting a permanent legal roadblock in the way. The environmental review process, if you get a judge to agree with you that the EIS wasn't done right, the judge doesn't say they can't come this way. The judge gives you your homework back, basically says, go back and do your homework again. You come back in 6 months or a year from now with a new EIS. So the judge doesn't say you can't ever come this way, just says you got to go back and do a better analysis, and BPA might just go back and pretty things up and end up with the same decision. Now, it could be when they go back and do the analysis, it may be they actually cause them to go another route. But the judge won't require that in an environmental review setting. But with the Endangered Species Act, you actually have some potential showstoppers if you have habitat that's critical to an endangered species that's going to be directly in the line of the route. I don't know whether that exists, but that's the sort of issue you'd be looking for in terms of legal impacts on this project. As I said at the beginning, though, I think the major way to influence this is through understanding what your legal rights are and using that information together with technical information to influence the political process. Now, the other set of questions was about, okay, let's say they are coming this way, or even right now, before they've made a decision, they want to come on my property to do an inspection. Should I let them? And there's a whole host of questions about that. I'm going to pull out these questions because I was not able to remember all of them. So, first question is, should I let them on the property just to do an inspection? I would say generally yes. I mean, this is definitely a personal decision for each of you to make. But frankly, in the end, the BPA, if they had to, they could go to court and make you let them on your property to do the inspection. So you're sort of just postponing the inevitable in one sense. Also, if you think that your property has some special qualities that make it particularly unsuitable for the power line, it's actually to your advantage to get BPA on your property and show that to them. If you have a wetland where they think they're going to put a tower, or you've got, one of the things they're looking for are cultural settings. archaeological digs and Native American resources, if you got anything like that on your land, you want the BPA to know about that. If you've got habitat that's particularly valuable for wildlife, you want BPA to know about that. The more valuable your property is, the less attractive it is to BPA. So then the question was, well, if they come on and they do some damage to my property, can I be compensated for that? Yes, you definitely can be compensated for it. They're required to compensate you for any damage they do to your property. They've indicated initially they may make in the course of this project several trips onto your property. The first time probably just almost like a windshield drive-up. They'll just walk around, probably take a look. Later on, when they get a little more serious, if they do get more serious, they may come on and want to drill some holes. They do, in the course of doing that, they've obviously got to clean up after themselves, and if they don't, you can force them to do it. Hopefully they'll be good neighbors, as it were, and not abuse the rights they have when they do that. Question was, could a landowner be sued if someone was injured on a BPA easement or access that is on your property? So I'm assuming this is a question about after the power line's in, and then somebody comes on the property and is injured on your property. Well, one of the things you'll want to do, and actually one of the things that will be helpful if we can do this as a group, is if we get that far down the road where BPA is actually coming this way and the easements are being negotiated, we can try to negotiate language in the easements that provides you protection in that situation. We want those easements to read that if anybody, if a BPA linesman comes on your property and twists their ankle or their truck runs into a ditch that they didn't see under the field, under the crops that are growing in the field or something, that BPA is going to be responsible for that, not you. And it's when you get an easement or any legal document, there's all that fine print on it. That's fine print is what decides whether that money is coming out of your pocket or the government's pocket if somebody has an accident on your property in that situation. And one thing I did in the Sound Transit case back up in Seattle was, rather than negotiating language like that 100 different times, we did it once. And everybody got together, we negotiated a single boilerplate document for that easement that protected every property owner along that route. That may be something you want to do to deal with situations like that. Another question. I've got some BPA, of course, needs just a line through your property and 150 feet wide. Your property may be 1 acre, might be 10 or 20 acres. The question is, what happens so they only need 150 feet through a part of it, what happens to the remainder? And if that remainder doesn't have any value, or even if it does, can I force BPA to buy the remainder? Because I don't want what's left over. So that's a common issue in condemnation law, and basically there's a couple of parts to that answer. The first part is when the initial value, well, let me start with way at the beginning. When they condemn your property, when they condemn a right-of-way across your property, that's just like if you're selling an easement to somebody, and they have to pay you for that easement. They have to pay for that right-of-way. And it's a little tricky putting a value on the value of an easement or a right-of-way, because these aren't bought and sold commonly, right? If you want to know how much your property's worth, selling the whole piece of property, well, you can get an idea for that by looking at what the property down the road recently sold for, that's something like your property, and then that's how an appraiser kind of figures out how much your property's worth. But easements aren't bought and sold like that. You can't go down and find out, well, what was who bought an easement recently, or at least there's not a lot of information like that. So it gets tricky valuing these easements, but appraisers come up with numbers, and when they do, they look at, the law requires them to look at not only the loss of your ability to use that 150 feet, but also the impact that has on the value of the rest of your property. So let's say, you can see this table, probably not, but let's say the 150 feet crosses your property in such a way that there's 10 feet left on one side. What can you do with 10 feet? Okay? So the law says basically that property over there, that last 10 feet is worthless, so the government has to pay you for that as well. Okay? That'd be a very obvious example. Now what happens if it's not 10 feet? What happens if it's 200 feet? What happens if it's 500 feet? What happens if it's a half acre or 3 acres? So these become very fact-specific situations. Every case is different as to whether there's an impact on the remainder, whether there's an impact on what they're not taking. If you can show that there's an impact on what they're not taking, you're entitled to the value of that impact. And if the remainder is property, and so the question was, can I force them to allow the whole property? If they're making the property essentially valueless, you can force them to buy the whole thing. So if, to give you an example, let's say your property is 180 feet wide, and they're putting a 150-foot corridor in the middle of it, leaving you 20 feet on one side and 10 feet on the other, you're probably going to be able to force them to buy the whole thing. They probably would buy the whole thing. They won't even object. Right? If your property is 10 acres wide, and they're coming through with 150, and you've got big chunks on the other side, it's going to be harder. But if on one side it's just a little piece, and on the other side there's a wetland or a creek, so even though it's a big piece, it's not really where there's any buildable land, you might still be able to argue that you haven't left me with anything worthwhile over there. So there's not I can't give you a general rule as to how it would work. Each case is going to be different, but that kind of gives you the general idea of what the issues will be. And then there was a question about how does an individual property owner best protect his or her property? Well, I back up and say, well, in part, goes back to the issue of figuring out what route they're going to take. If your interest is in avoiding condemnation, the best way for you to protect your property is to join forces with others who are opposed to the route in your neighborhood and go in together. If the question is in terms of how do I best protect my property if they made a decision and they're coming my way and they're now condemning, still, there's power in numbers as that Sound Transit case, negotiating the easement, the form of the easement, the fine print of the easement is best going to be done on a group setting if we can do that. When it gets down to coming up with a dollar amount, how much money do I get, that you're going to have to do on a one-on-one basis, and you're going to want to get an appraiser and probably a lawyer if there's a dispute between you and the government as to how much they're offering to pay you.